So opinions tend to run high and our shared set of facts run low when we're talking about immigration. So we're here to talk about how we as believers, as people of faith, can be speaking faithfully about the issue of immigration and come to a shared set of facts about how the system really works. So we're going to be looking at the 4 different ways that people from other countries can try to immigrate to this country legally. So we will start first with family preference visas.
Yes, and so I have a very simplified version of the application that someone would fill out, and so that's what I'm going to be kind of talking through. So that, as Melissa said, this is the family preference system, and so it's for people who want to come and be reunited with a family member. And it's actually that family member that petitions for them to come. And so the 2 groups of people that can petition for a family member to come are either U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. And so that's one of the first things that we hear, like, oh, people want to bring families here, but you have to have legal status in the U.S. or be a U.S. citizen in order to petition for your family to come. And so if you're a U.S. citizen, you have to be 21 years or older to petition for a family member to come. And you can petition for your spouse or fiancé, for your parent, or for your child and sibling to come. So those are the only family members you can petition for. So if you have cousins, aunts and uncles, grandparents, you are not allowed to petition for them. And then the wait times depend on your relationship to the family member that's sponsoring you, and also your country of origin and how many applicants are in the line ahead of you. So the fastest wait time is if you're the spouse, fiancé, parent, or minor child, so under 21, of a U.S. citizen. Then the wait time is typically 5 to 15 months to receive a visa to come to the U.S. However, if you're a sibling, the wait times are much longer. You're way lower on the priority of coming to the U.S. So wait times can be around 11 to 22 years for you to be able to come to the U.S. And then if you're the adult child of a U.S. citizen, it also depends if you're married or not. If you're married, it's going to take longer because then your spouse and children under 21 are also allowed to come. And again, this also depends on what country you're from. So there's a maximum number of family-sponsored visas that can be issued to citizens of any one country. So it can't exceed about 7% of the overall visas. And so that's why for countries like China, Mexico, and the Philippines, there's a huge backlog for these visas. However, Congress doesn't place a limit on the number of spouses and minors, so under 21 children, to come. So that's why the wait times for those are a lot shorter. So we don't put a limit on how many spouses or children U.S. citizens can sponsor to come. And then if you're a legal permanent resident, so a green card holder is another name for this group of people, you can only sponsor your child or your spouse. And your child has to be under 21. And if they're over 21, they cannot be married. They have to be single. And again, on average, for your spouse or child under 21, it takes about 3 to 5 years to petition for them to come. So that's a little bit about the family preference visa. And again, this one is for people who want to be reunited with their family member, and their family member in the U.S. has to either be a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident.
So another way that folks can try to come to the U.S. legally is through employment if they are coming to work. Now, it's not enough to just be willing to work or to be able to work. You either have to have extraordinary ability or you must be a skilled worker, and I'll unpack that a little bit. So within 12 to 18 months, someone with extraordinary ability, meaning they have between $500,000 and $1 million to invest in the U.S. and a guarantee that they will hire at least 10 full-time workers in the U.S., then they are able to come. And extraordinary ability can also mean someone, like think of a star athlete or something, someone in the arts, science, education, business, athletics, that very small sort of subset of extraordinary ability. And again, those folks can come much more quickly than others, as we've talked about, that they can come within 12 to 18 months. To be a skilled worker and to come with that sort of visa, you must have a permanent full-time job offer already extended to you to be able to get the visa. So what needs to happen before all of that, before getting extended the offer for work, you have to have an advanced degree. So either 2 years of work experience or that college or advanced degree in the field which you're seeking to work. And even before that, the employer has a lot of things that they need to do as well. So they need to prove to the U.S. government that there's no other U.S. citizen able and willing to work in that job. And they also have to petition for you as that working immigrant. So they need to be willing to pay up to $10,000 in legal fees to work through the process to bring you here. And then they need to be willing to wait up to in some cases, up to 6 to 10 years. So both the employer and the individual as the working immigrant would need to be willing to wait.
There's also temporary work visas that your employer can apply for you while you're waiting so that you can come to the U.S. and start working. However, those are usually renewed every year. And so every year that you're waiting to receive your permanent residency card through employment, you'd have to be waiting on these temporary visas to work. So a lot of the times we hear people talk about, why are there so many undocumented immigrants? Why don't they just get in line and come the legal way? But as you've seen with this employment one, if you're, for example, in agriculture, a non-skilled worker, you can't apply through this visa. And really, we give 5,000 visas a year for unskilled workers that don't meet this criteria. But these are millions of people apply every year, and only 5,000 are given. So it's really, really backlogged. Whereas if you were to apply today, we're currently processing applications in the US from like the early 1990s. So you'd have to wait many, many years, and there's no guarantee because only 5,000 are given every year, and we start at the front of the line when people first started applying for these. So virtually that's not a way that you can come in reality as you're an unskilled worker. And so we also have the reality that we have between 50 and 70% of our agricultural workers are undocumented. And so think about that. 50 to 70% of all of the food that we eat, that goes into our meals, that goes into our church potlucks, that goes into sharing with our family, are picked by undocumented immigrants who don't have legal status to be here. But as you've seen with this employment one, that this is not a line that they can come and work here in the US permanently. And there are a couple of options for temporary work visas, so seasonal agricultural workers and temporary non-agricultural workers. But again, we give so few of those, and they're very restricted to what kinds of agricultural work you can do. So for example, dairy farmers, they're not seasonal agricultural workers. Dairy farms run all year long. So they can't apply for this seasonal workers. And also seasonal workers are tied to whatever farm they came with. So if you ever wanted to switch and go work at a different farm because there was more demand at that farm, you'd have to reapply for the whole process outside of the US. And so these visas not meeting the demand that we have for non-skilled, for agriculture, for dairy farmers, and that's why we see that such a high number of 50 to 70% of our agricultural workers being undocumented.
So another category that folks can try to apply for, one of the 4 doors that we're talking about, is the diversity visa, which essentially works like a lottery system. So this visa category was created in 1990 to allow for immigrants from countries with low rates of immigration to the United States to come here. And it's not just random and not just anyone can apply. You do have to meet certain criteria. So for example, this isn't for folks who are poor, because when you submit an application or when you file the application, it costs $330 plus any additional fees. And if you're not selected at the end of it, you don't get that money back. So there's that piece. And you also need to be educated. So you need at least a high school diploma or an equivalent or 2 years of experience in a job. So it's not just anyone that can qualify for that, for the diversity visa. So each year, 50,000 diversity visas are given, and but for example, in 2015, 9 million individuals applied. So you have about a 1 in 160 chance of being selected for this visa.
And then the last way that people can immigrate to the U.S. permanently is through refugee or asylum seeking cases. So a refugee or an asylum seeker are people who are fleeing persecution, but it's not just any type of persecution. There's a very strict definition that's set by the United Nations and that the U.S. has adopted. And so you have to have a well-founded fear or you be persecuted due to your race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group or political opinion. So you have to be persecuted for one of those reasons, again, due to race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. And then you qualify as a refugee or asylum seeker. So now let's talk a little bit about the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker. A refugee is someone who has had to flee their country of origin and go to a different country because of persecution. And then there they receive refugee status from the United Nations. And then the United Nations chooses the most vulnerable of those refugees to be resettled into what is called a third country. So your first country is where you're originally from. Your second country is where you flee, so you cross the border as a refugee. And then if you're resettled permanently into a third country like the US, that's why it's called a third country. And there are about 30 countries that participate in refugee resettlement like the US. And so refugees who come to the US already have legal status. They were given that by the UN. They don't get to choose what country of those 30 they're resettled in. Normally the UN tries to, if they have family members or some connection to a country, to go to that country, but they don't get to choose. And then when they arrive at the country, they already have the legal permanent residency, refugee legal status. If you're an asylum seeker, you've also had to flee your country, but then you would try to get to whatever country you wanted to go and then cross the border and seek asylum. So you would turn yourself in and say you're seeking asylum because you're persecuted, and then you would start getting processed then. And you'd go through the same system as the refugee does in the same process, except you're doing it in the country that you're seeking asylum. And again, refugees and asylum seekers are the most vetted group of immigrants to come to the U.S. They're vetted by 4 different U.S. agencies. They go through health screenings. They have to have all the right paperwork. And some people say, well, what if a refugee had to flee and didn't have that right paperwork? Then they wouldn't be allowed to come in, because you need to have all the right documentation, all the right security screenings, all the right medical screenings. And all of those can take up to 2 years to do all the process. So a lot of refugees actually end up spending a lot of years in refugee camps in that second country where they flee. And actually the majority of refugees are in these refugee camps. And so there are about 21 million refugees worldwide, or that's the last statistic I read. It's probably higher now. And only about 1% of those refugees will ever be permanently resettled into one of those 30 countries, the third country. There's also about 65 million displaced persons worldwide. So it's people who have had to leave their hometown because of persecution. Not all of these obviously are counted as refugees. As I said, 21 million are refugees. Some of this is because they're internally displaced, so they're within their same country, they haven't crossed the border yet, so you don't qualify as a refugee. Or others are because they don't meet that definition, that strict definition of what a refugee is. So for example, migrants fleeing economic problems or lack of opportunity in Africa to come to Europe are not counted as refugees because they're not being persecuted due to race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So that is the first criteria you have to meet to be a refugee or asylum seeker, be persecuted because of those reasons. And then the second criteria is you have to prove the severity of your case. So you can't just say, I feel persecuted. You have to have proof. You have to have documentation of how you've been persecuted. And a lot of the people who receive that is because it's known worldwide. For example, the Rohingya, or people fleeing South Sudan, right? We hear about these. We know that these people are persecuted. There are documentation known for this. And so a lot of the times refugees really do need legal help. You are 5 times more likely to receive refugee or asylum seeking status if you have legal representation, because there are very specific ways that you prove that you are persecuted. And so that is the last way that people seeking to come to the U.S. to live here permanently can use to come. And so these are the only 4 ways. There are no other ways that people who want to move here permanently can use to come to the U.S. These are the 4 doors or 4 pathways as we talk about them. There are obviously temporary student, tourist visas, but these are the 4 ways if you wanted to move to the U.S. permanently. And so oftentimes we hear a lot of conversation around immigration, around people getting in line, coming the legal way. So we hope that this has been a resource you can use to learn more about these 4 ways, and to also, when you hear other people talking about them, now you can share with them some of the information you have learned about these 4 only ways that people can use to move to the U.S. permanently.